so that people who are talking about the traditional definition of racism as racism are being accused of denying racism because they're not talking about the new definition of racism, which is actually a product of a Marxist critical theory getting its foot in the door.
Another common misconception that people have about Monique is that she's a racism. I don't know if he's still there. There he is. That she's a racism denier. And because she's not for an advocate of critical race theory, well, then she must be a racism denier. I'm wondering if you've had that accusation against you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a straw man, right? And it is the classic straw man of critical race theory. People are saying that critical race theory is just being honest and accurate about America's racist past. Well, that's a lie from the pit of hell. Critical race theory is an ideology. And I would argue that critical race theory is a theology, right? It is a perspective about racism, right? Not just the idea of teaching about racism. And the other thing is, the reason that people say that is because they've done a bait and switch. So what you do is you change the definition of racism. Literally, the dictionaries have changed the definition of racism over the last decade to where you go from racism being about prejudice towards groups of people, stereotypes and prejudices towards groups of people. We've now redefined racism to where racism is first prejudice plus power. And then racism is a manifestation of white supremacy that creates inequities, right? So on and so forth. So what we do is we move the goalpost, right? We shift the Overton window and we redefine racism so that people who are talking about the traditional definition of racism as racism are being accused of denying racism because they're not talking about the new definition of racism, which is actually a product of a Marxist critical theory getting its foot in the door, right? And so I just don't play that game, you know? I don't do that. I hold people's feet to the fire, right? And I say, if you're going to make that accusation, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to define your terms, right? I may be denying racism depending on how you're defining racism. And you may be denying racism depending on how you're defining racism. So let's define our terms. And what I find is that for the most part, people can't define their terms. Or when you nail them down to their terms, then they can't give you concrete examples of what they're talking about. So for me, I don't play that game. I got too much gray in my beard for you to be shaming me, into saying that I'm this when I know that I'm not.